Good evening. I'm Franco Moretti. I'm a permanent fellow here at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and I'm introducing the speaker tonight. Luca Giuliani, he came to the Wissenschaftskolleg for the first time in 1999 as a fellow. A few years later, he joined the Beirat, the selection committee for the VICO. In 2007, became rector. He stayed in that position till 2018, and since then he's been a permanent fellow. So for a quarter century, basically, his life has been entwined with that of the Wissenschaftskolleg. And at first, I had thought of giving a presentation thinking about that, the institutional side of Luca Giuliani, how a person can shape an institution, be shaped by an institution. Then I went in a completely different direction. That is to say, it's going to be a short introduction, don't worry, which is to say, the eccentric side of Luca's work. Eccentric, not because of its objects, because the objects couldn't be more classical. The Discobolus, the Laocoon, the Davide, the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici, ancient Greece, Renaissance Florence, in modern Germany. It's a very well-known story. But along this story, what Luca does with these works and others, all these essays have been written in the last 10 years, more or less, it's not well known at all. And he basically goes always through the same process, which is he begins with a detail that we've seen, of course, in these works, and that basically we think just goes without saying, yeah, sure, that's... What kind of a pose exactly is, how is the discus going to be thrown here? Try stand in that pose, you will fall. So it can't be a position. What is going on? What kind of movement, and what does it say about the Greek conception of movement? What is Laocoon exactly doing with the arm that is mostly missing? Initially, at the beginning, for a long time, it was reconstructed as this, and now, including because of work he has done, is reconstruct. What is at stake in the difference between these two reconstructions? Actually, the meaning of a large part of the structure and of the emotions in the group are at stake. What is Davide holding in his left hand? He's clearly looking at Goliath. Goliath cannot be too close because he's still very quiet. But he's looking in that direction and he's holding something. And usually people say, well, this is the shot that he's holding. But the point is, with that kind of stone, you don't kill a giant. You probably don't even kill a normal human being. Besides, it can't be the shot, because the kind of sling that he's using, the shot is placed not at an extremity, but in the middle. So what is that? Incidentally, you see how in these first three cases, all riddles have to do with an image interpreted as a moment in a narrative. Throwing a discus, fighting with snakes, preparing yourself to struggle. And this could have been another introduction on Luca's work on the relation between images and stories. I'll go into slight more detail in this case. This is the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence. What is that strange thing, brick, on which he's resting his elbows? The answer has been unanimous until a few years ago. This is a casket. Kästchen, cash box, cassette, and solved the mystery, then immediately interpretation. It's a casket, it's a cash box, it stands for parsimony, stands for wisdom, etc., etc. Luca Giuliani, how can it be a casket if there is no way to open it? How can it be a cash box? So it's not a casket. What could it be? Well, it could be, and probably is, two things simultaneously. The rectangular three-dimensional image stands for the raw materials of the sculpture's art, which comes in these huge blocks. And this figure here stands for the opposite of that, not the raw materials, but the imaginative freedom of the sculpture. And once you see that it's an imaginary creature, he calls it a Löwenmaus, an echo of Fledermaus. And actually, those big ears probably made him think of the Fledermaus as well. Once you see that, you also realize that the unfinished portion of so many of Michelangelo's work has a structural element. It's not just occasional, because it has to do with this composition. So this is how he works. Many years ago, Alexander Coiré wrote a famous essay, which is From the World of the More or Less to the Universe of Precision. This is what happens here. More or less, we know what David is doing there. More or less, well, casket, block of stone, come on. No, something is at stake here, and not just precision for precision's sake, valuable as I think Luca thinks that is, and I agree. It's not just precision for precision's sake, it's that something even more fundamental than that is in play. Look again at this. The essay is published. The Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg reads it, and he says, but it's clear. This is an allusion to chapter 18 of Machiavelli's Prince. The prince has to be a lion to frighten away wolves and like a fox to figure out traps. So I then go talk to Luca. I said, what do you think of this? He said, well, it would be beautiful. It would make so much sense. It makes so much sense if Machiavelli and Michelangelo knew each other, if Michelangelo had made a reference. There's just one problem. It's not a fox. It doesn't look like a fox. If Michelangelo wanted to sculpt a fox, there would be a fox there. See here what precision does. It's not just that you get a good description. You get a description that stresses the hardness of the objects with which, these are all stones, incidentally, the raw materials of the archaeologists, not just of the sculptor. Yeah, of course, we can interpret this in as many ways as well, but we cannot redescribe it and reshape it at our will. So I don't think I've ever heard Luca Giuliani utter or write the word materialism, but to me, one of his main intellectuals, it's an irrepressible, spontaneous, innate, if that can be said, materialism, like one seldom sees. So it's a devotion to the object, which, like all such efforts at, relentless materialism, has a lot of lucidity, has also a lot of melancholy, a sense of limits, sense of the opposite of the omnipotence of interpretation. And then something very different. We were talking up there in his study a few years ago. He was working at the Davide. There was something about the sling that he couldn't just figure out. There was something that didn't add up. We chatted a little bit. I know nothing about slings, so I left, closed the door. I was talking, saying goodbye to the secretary in the other room, and then I heard, Franco, vieni a vedere, come see. What had happened? He had found the sling on Amazon. And that's someone who has such a stern and strong sense of, as I said, devotion to the object of scholarly duty, etc., could also preserve this kind of childlike joy at having found a new toy. This, to me, is one of the great gifts of Luca Giuliani's work. So, please, Luca, vieni a parlare.
This is all different tonight because I'm going to talk about texts. And this, of course, has also something to do with Franco. Am I being understood, even to the very back? Good. My topic tonight will be a puzzling passage in a chapter of Primo Levi's book, Se questo è un uomo, 1947. This chapter deals with a famous canto in Dante's comedy, Inferno XXVI, the protagonist of which is the ancient hero Ulysses. To solve the puzzle in Levi, it will be necessary to consider the role Ulysses plays in Dante and in the reception of the comedy since the 14th century. I shall proceed in 6 steps. First, I will introduce Primo Levi and his book, If This Is a Man, focusing on the chapter 11, the Canto of Ulysses. Levi assumes that his readers are familiar with Dante's Canto, to which he refers, so second step, I shall summarize its plot, Inferno Canto 26. 3, having done this, we shall return to Levi's chapter, bringing into focus what exactly is puzzling about its ending. 4, solving the puzzle depends on the interpretation of Dante's Ulysses, which has been controversial since the late 14th century, and the controversy is still alive today. Some scholars see Ulysses simply as a sinner, others see him as a hero and the prophet of modernity. 5, I'll try to show why one of these interpretations is right and the other is wrong. And 6, we shall finally come back to Primo Levi and to the puzzle we started with in the beginning. So, step 1. Let me give you first a few informations about the author. Levi was born to a middle-class Jewish family in Turin in 1919. He grew up, graduated in chemistry, married and had 2 children, but he never moved out of the apartment in which he had been born. He had a very quiet professional life, working for almost 30 years in a small chemical factory near Turin, as a technician at first, in the end as the factory's director. In his spare time, he used to write with increasing success. He died in 1987. And all this sounds like a very tranquil biography without great breaks. But I have skipped the decisive element, and that is Auschwitz. In the fall of 1943, Levi, then 24 years old, joined a group of partisans. He was almost immediately caught and transferred to a prison camp. In February 1944, this camp was handed over to the SS. Just a week later, all Jewish inmates, something like 600, were put on a train with destination Auschwitz. In Levi's case, this meant the camp of Monowitz, which is so-called Auschwitz III. Auschwitz III, 7 kilometers from Auschwitz I. The camp was connected to a factory that produced synthetic rubber, owned by IG Farben, the biggest conglomerate of chemical industries in Germany. IG Farben had financed the construction of the camp, and its inmates were put to work for the factory. In a technical sense, Monowitz was not an extermination camp like Birkenau, Auschwitz II. It was a forced labor camp. Nevertheless, the normal consequence of such labor was death. The life expectancy of the inmates was around 4 months. From the very beginning, Levi felt that he was part of something unprecedented, a kind of monstrous social experiment, and he felt it was mandatory to observe and to try to understand what was going on. Later, Levi used to say that during his stay in Monowitz, his perceptions had been as vivid and as precise as never before or afterwards. In November, having been identified as a professional chemist, he was put to work inside the factory in the shelter, where conditions were a bit less harsh. On January 27th, 1945, when the Red Army liberated the camp, Levi was seriously ill, but still alive. Levi's experience of the concentration camp turned him into a writer. In the fall of 1945, he was back in Turin and almost immediately started writing. The resulting manuscript was accepted by a small publishing house under the title suggested by the publisher, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man. It's a quotation from a poem at the beginning of the book. It got a few positive reviews, but did not sell. A second, slightly modified version was published in 1958, 11 years later, this time by Einaudi, one of the major Italian publishers, and the impact was greater. An English translation came out in 1960, If This Is a Man, a German one in 1961, Ist das ein Mensch? Since the early 70s, the book has been standard reading for several years in Italian schools. It is considered one of the great novels of the 20th century. It is also, I think, an absolute masterpiece of ethnographic literature. The chapter we shall look at more closely deals explicitly with the Canto from Dante's Inferno, but actually the whole book is full of allusions to Dante. Just one example. One of the chapters is titled I sommersi e I salvati, the submerged and the saved. Levi had planned to use this title for the whole book, and both terms are found in Dante, who calls the souls in hell I sommersi. I salvati are, of course, those admitted to paradise. For Levi, in a change of meaning, the submerged are those who were killed in the camp. The saved are those who survived. And Levi's persistent question to himself and to the reader is, at what price? The story of chapter 11, the Canto of Ulysses, is simple. Among the members of Levi's working group, there is Jean, a young pharmacy student from Alsace, who serves as an aide to the capo. Levi calls him Piccolo, and they have become friends. One day, Piccolo and Levi are in charge of fetching the soup for their commando. This implies a walk of about a mile, a break, during which they can talk. Piccolo, who speaks French and German, would like to learn Italian, and Levi is happy to teach him in French. He takes as a starting point, quote, who knows how or why it comes to my mind, end quote, the Canto of Ulysses, Canto 26 of the Inferno. And this is the first fragment Levi quotes. I will read in this quotation and in all the following just the Italian original, and you find on the right the translation. This is the translation by Dorothy Sayers. I'm very grateful to the library, and particularly to Stefan Gellner, who did a huge amount of research about English translations, finding out in the end that in the translations that was published in 1960 of If This Is a Man, the translator, Stuart Wolff, had used, without mentioning it, the translation by Dorothy Sayers, published in 1949, the translation of Dante. Lo maggior corno della fiamma antica cominciò a crollarsi mormorando, pur come quella a cui vento affatica. Indi la cima qua e là menando come fosse la lingua che parlasse, gittò voce di fuori e disse quando. The comedy is composed in tercets, each line having 11 syllables. The first and the third line of each tercet are associated by rhyme, antica a fatica, while the second line, mormorando, announces the rhyme of the next tercet, menando, quando. This scheme, A, B, C, B, etc., is obviously designed to favor memorization. Nevertheless, in Monowitz, after a few lines, Levi's memory fails him. He remembers only fragments and tries to bring them into some kind of order and to reconstruct what is missing. Anybody who has been a pupil in an Italian high school will find himself or herself in a comparable situation, knowing some of these lines by heart and struggling, like Levi, with the lacunae. The fragment quoted describes a flame that is about to start speaking. What flame it is and in what context, Levi does not say. Let us look at another quotation. Here, listen, piccolo. Open your ears and your mind. You have to understand for my sake. Considerate la vostra semenza, fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. As if I also was hearing it for the first time. Like the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. For a moment, I forget who I am and where I am. Piccolo begs me to repeat it. How good Piccolo is. He's aware that he is doing me good. Or perhaps it is something more. Perhaps he has received the message. He has felt that it has to do with him, that it has to do with all men who toil, and with us in particular, who dare to reason on these things with the poles for the soup on their shoulders. The 3 lines, Dante lines, quoted are famous. Anybody who has become acquainted with Dante in an Italian school is likely to know them by heart. But again, Levi does not tell the reader who is speaking and to whom. Writing his novel in 1946, he was obviously addressing an Italian audience. He assumed his readers would be familiar with the plot of Inferno, Canto 26. This is not necessarily the case tonight, so I shall give you a summary. But before I do this, let me just remind you of Levi's remark, quote, who knows how or why this specific canto, comes to my mind? Well, this question seems to get a very clear answer. Levi quotes these verses and this canto because of its message, because they have to do with all men who toil, and with Piccolo and him in particular. And this was indeed a very good reason to choose Canto 26. Step 2. In the comedy, Dante is being led by Virgil on a journey down to the bottom of hell, from where he will find his way up again through purgatory, and then without Virgil ending in paradise. Dante's hell has the shape of a gigantic funnel. You see here the scheme of the whole world. Here is hell, here is Jerusalem, and here just underneath Jerusalem there is a huge funnel down to the center of earth. They will travel down here, then up here through this very narrow path to the Mount of Purgatory, which is exactly opposite Jerusalem, and from there to paradise. And here you see a cut through the whole of hell, and I will not go into details, but what will matter to us is what happens in the 8th, what do you call them? No, Bolgia. Bolgia, the 8th sector of the 8th circle, This is all the 8th circle, and this is the 8th horizon, the 8th stripe of the 8th circle. So it's rather deep down. It's not at the beginning of hell. It's rather deep. So the funnel consists of 9 concentric circles. In the 8th circle are punished those who have been culpable of fraud. The circle is divided into 10 evil ditches, malebolge, one for each specific variant of the sin of fraud. In Canto 26, we are in the 8th ditch, therefore the 8th ditch of the 8th circle, which hosts inventors of fraud and evil advisors. Each sinner is burning inside a mobile flame that hides him from sight. Only one of these flames is double-headed, and this is the flame described in the lines Levi quotes, lo maggior corno della fiamma antica, etc. And in this flame, in this double-headed flame, Virgil explains Ulysses and Diomedes are punished together. Virgil mentions 3 of their sins, all of them connected with the Trojan War. The trick by which the 2 persuaded Achilles to participate in the war, which would lead to his death. The trick, the theft, second, this was the trick of persuading Achilles. Second, the theft of the sacred image of Athena, on which the safety of Troy depended. And third, the famous stratagem of the wooden horse. Dante is eager to speak to them. Virgil begs the flame to stop and one of the 2 to tell how he came to die. And it will be Achilles that answers. In this answer, Ulysses narrates the story of his last journey and death. And this story has no parallels in ancient literature. Dante never read Homer, but he was familiar with Latin authors. He knew that Ulysses, after the end of the Trojan War, was prevented from returning home by the anger of the god Neptune, whom he had offended. For 10 long years, Ulysses was obliged to wander across the sea, experiencing all sorts of adventures and getting to know more people and places than anybody else before him. In the end, Neptune's resistance was overcome and Ulysses found his way home. Dante knew all this, but he chose to give the story a radically different ending. For the ancients, Ulysses had undergone adventures inflicted on him by fate. He had acquired experiences, but against his will. Dante's Ulysses, at a certain point of his peregrinations, takes the free decision not to return home, but to continue his explorations. In Canto 26, he begins his narration by recalling the human beings he used to love most and who were all waiting for him. But his love for them was not strong enough to match his desire to explore the world. Né dolcezza di figlio, né la pietà del vecchio padre, nel debito amore lo qual dovea Penelope far lieta, vincer potero dentro a me l'ardore chi ebbe a divenir del mondo esperto e degli vizi umani e del valore. So Ulysses, accompanied by a few companions, decides not to return home and to continue his journey. After many years, they have all become old and slow, vecchi e tardi. They finally reach the straits between Spain and Morocco. Here, Hercules had erected his so-called pillars, Ulysses tells us, as a sign that no human should proceed further. The companions expect the journey to end here and have already turned the ship in order to sail back, but with a short speech, Oratium Picciola, Ulysses succeeds in changing their mind. And this is the speech as Ulysses himself reports it. O frati, dissi, che per 100 miglia perigli siete giunti all'Occidente, a questa tanto picciola vigilia dei nostri sensi che è del rimanente, non vogliate negar l'esperienza di retro al sol del mondo senza gente. Considerate la vostra semenza. Fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. The last 3 lines are those Levi recited for Piccolo, comparing them to the blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. Ulysses' companions are overwhelmed by the speech. Nobody thinks anymore of returning home, and they set off into the ocean. Dante believed that what we call the Straits of Gibraltar was the end of the inhabited world. Beyond the straits was a world of waters without any land. That's why Ulysses calls it the uninhabited world, the world without people, il mondo senza gente. After 5 months of voyage, in which Ulysses and his companions have seen no land, there appears still far away a huge mountain, higher than any other they had ever seen. They rejoice, but not for long. From the unknown island, a whirlwind approaches and hits the ship. The subject is whirlwind. 3 volte il fe girar con tutte l'acque. Alla quarta levar la poppa in suso e la prora ire in giù, come altrui piacque, infinché il mar fu sopra noi richiuso. This is the end of Ulysses' story and the end of the Canto. What island and what mountain was Ulysses about to reach? Ulysses himself gives no explanation. Dante, the protagonist of the story, does not know, and neither does the reader. Only when the reader reaches the second part of the comedy, he will learn that the island is to be identified with the island of Purgatory. Still, if we said that at the end of Canto 26, Ulysses was about to reach the island of Purgatory, this would not be entirely accurate. At the time of Ulysses' journey, the mountain was not yet the mountain of Purgatory. Purgatory in Dante's Cosmos was installed only after the death of Christ. Ulysses' shipwreck, of course, happens long before that. At that time, the mountain on the island hosted on its top terrestrial paradise. Here God had created Adam and Eve, and from here they had been expelled after eating the forbidden fruit. Since then, no human being was allowed to approach terrestrial paradise. The entrance is guarded by a cherub, an angel with a flaming sword, so we are told in Genesis. And this seems to be also the reason for the deadly shipwreck. The whirlwind is nothing but a variant of the flaming sword, and this background gives a precise meaning to Ulysses' words when he says that his ship sank, quote, as it pleased another, cum altrui piacque, end quote. The other intended here is God, whose name can never be uttered in hell. With this, we have the whole plot of the Ulysses episode as told by Dante, and we can come back to Levi. Step 3. Levi and Piccolo have almost come to the end of their walk. It is late. We have reached the kitchen. I must finish. 3 volte il fe girar con tutte l'acque, alla quarta levar la poppa in suso e la prora ire in giù come altrui piacque. End quote. If you have in mind Dante's text on the previous or the pre-previous slide, This is almost, but not quite, the end of the canto. There is one line still missing. But at this point, after cum altrui piacque, as pleased another, Levi interrupts the quotation in order to comment. And here, close to the end of the chapter, the text becomes puzzling. I keep Piccolo back. It is vitally necessary and urgent that he listen, that he understand this as pleased another before it is too late. Tomorrow he or I might be dead, or we might never see each other again. I must tell him. I must explain to him about the Middle Ages, about the so human and so necessary and yet unexpected anachronism. But still more, something gigantic that I myself have only just seen in a flash of intuition. Perhaps the reason for our fate, for our being here today. We are now in the soup queue among the sordid, ragged crowd of soup carriers from other commandos. The official announcement is made that the soup today is of cabbages and turnips, choux e navet, caposta e srepac. Infinché il mar fu sopra noi rinchiuso. The chapter ends with the last line of Canto 26. In Dante, the first-person plural refers to Ulysses and his companions. In Levi, quoting Dante, it refers to Levi and Piccolo and the other inmates of the camp. The sea closing up has become a metaphor for the camp, and Ulysses, submerged by the ocean, is the prototype of those whom Levi calls I sommersi, the submerged ones. So much is clear. But how are we to understand what immediately preceded? The sentence about the so human and so necessary anachronism. And even more importantly, what is it that Levi has just seen in a flash of intuition, something gigantic? The reason for their fate, for being where they are in Auschwitz? Levi does not have the time to tell Piccolo. But neither does Levi, the narrator, tell the reader of the book. The chapter ends and the matter is never taken up again. So here is our puzzle. What is meant by the so human anachronism? And what is it that Levi has just seen in a flash of intuition? What is it that he is not telling us? And this not telling is in itself a very puzzling feature. For Levi is a writer who detests obscurity, who aims at ultimate clarity. This one chapter, nevertheless, ends hinting very clearly at something that remains unsaid. To solve this puzzle, we have to take a closer look at some ambiguous facets of Dante's Ulysses. Step 4. The first thing to say is that for Dante, Ulysses is a figure of primary importance, so not only for Levi, but already for Dante. Let me quote Dante's unusual introduction to the Ulysses episode at the beginning of Canto 26. And this is not in Levi, so I'm quoting Dante that remains unquoted by Levi. Allor mi dolsi, e ora mi ridolgo quando drizzo la mente a ciò ch'io vidi, e più longegno affreno chi non soglio, perché non corra che virtù nol guidi. Dante stresses the sorrow he felt then as a wanderer, as a protagonist of the comedy, and that he feels again now as the comedy's narrator, recalling his encounter with Ulysses. And such an emotional involvement is unusual. Wandering through hell, Dante usually feels neither sorrow nor pity. in the face of God's punishing justice, his usual reaction as a Christian is to approve. Why does Ulysses cause him so much sorrow? There seems to be some kind of connection between Ulysses and himself, but how exactly are they connected? Ulysses is among the heroes of antiquity the one with the greatest intellectual capabilities. He's a master of speech and persuasion, and the speech by which he persuades his companions to continue their journey is a masterpiece of the genre. Ulysses is cunning and unpredictable, tenacious and imaginative. He's also a resourceful inventor of frauds and lies. And finally, he is an experienced seafarer. During his wanderings over the sea, he also managed to visit the underworld. Dante does not mention the episode of the visit to the underworld in the comedy, but he seems to have known about it because it transformed Ulysses' visit to the underworld into a failed attempt to land on the island of terrestrial paradise. Dante himself is going to visit terrestrial paradise at the end of the second part of the comedy. So Ulysses turns out to be a precursor of Dante, even though his own trip ends in a catastrophe. So Ulysses is an inventor of fraud and an evil advisor, but he's also a daring explorer of the unknown and a precursor of Dante. How are we to reconcile these different facets of one and the same character? There is more scholarly literature on Ulysses than on any other figure in Dante's comedy. And to this discussion we must now turn, for it will offer us the key to solve the puzzle we have found in Levi's text. Ulysses the sinner or Ulysses the hero? If we put the question in these terms, most of you would probably say, as Dante meets Ulysses in hell, he's very likely to be understood as a sinner. Many Dante scholars have and would agree, but not all of them. Quite a number of them have insisted that Ulysses is to be understood as a hero, and more specifically, as we shall see, as a hero of modernity. The controversy about the interpretation of Ulysses starts in the late 14th century and is still alive today. A good starting point is an extensive commentary of the comedy in Latin written in the 1380s. The author of this commentary, Benvenuto da Imola, is full of admiration for Ulysses, the greatest fox, he calls him, of all the ancients. Benvenuto quotes the sins Ulysses have committed following Virgil's description in Dante, but he sees them less as moral faults than as the proof of Ulysses' intellectual capabilities. The climax of the whole episode he finds in Ulysses' speech to his companions, exhorting them to pursue their voyage, to follow after virtue and knowledge. Benvenuto praises Ulysses as a spirited hero who spared neither efforts nor dangers for the noble and truly human purpose of gaining experience of the world. This interpretation of Ulysses, first uttered in the late 14th century, has become very popular since the 19th century, and for understandable reasons. After the Renaissance, after the Enlightenment, it became more and more attractive to interpret Ulysses as a forerunner of the Renaissance, as a forerunner of the Enlightenment and of modernity in general. I call this the humanistic interpretation, of which I will give you just two prominent examples. I could easily give dozens. Francesco de Sanctis, the founding father of literary criticism in Italy, in his seminal History of Italian Literature, published in 1870, has a passage in which he interprets Dante's Ulysses as a titanic figure full of noble audacity, a precursor of Christopher Columbus. In Ulysses, as he paradoxically notes, as De Sanctis paradoxically notes, quote, sin becomes virtue. End quote. 50 years later, Benedetto Croce, the Italian philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, published a little book celebrating the 6th centenary of Dante's death. And like De Sanctis, Croce shares Ulysses' passion for knowledge and admires his daring to overcome conventional limits. He sees Ulysses as an exception among the sinners of the Eighth Circle, which is why the narration of his voyage should be read, as he says, as an independent poem. Many agreed, and I experienced this myself. When I was going to school in Florence in the 1960s, I was taught to read Ulysses' speech as a humanistic manifesto, as the voice of enlightened reason. But if this humanistic interpretation of Ulysses is correct, how can we then explain that Dante placed him in one of the deepest circles of hell? This is a question that Benvenuto, writing his commentary in the late 14th century, did not ask, but that has become unavoidable for all more recent proponents of the humanistic interpretation. Their usual answer consists in stressing the ambiguity of Ulysses' figure and the necessity to distinguish clearly between Ulysses, the evil advisor and inventor of fraud, who has been rightly condemned to eternal punishment on one side, and on the other side, Ulysses, the voyager. It is the latter Ulysses who tells Dante and Virgil his story, speaking for the highest aspirations of men. The message of the heroic explorer remains pure, uncontaminated by sin. But is this clear distinction between two different Ulysses really convincing? This remains disputed to the present day. Step 5. I shall examine 3 arguments of scholars who defend the humanistic interpretations and do not consider the last voyage to be a sin. First argument. The voyage is not a sin, it is said, because Virgil does not mention it in his short list of Ulysses' sins. This, of course, is hardly convincing. Virgil does not mention the voyage, true, but simply because he has no knowledge of it. Nobody knew about this last trip, for all the witnesses had perished in the shipwreck. Second, approaching the island of the terrestrial paradise, Ulysses violates a commandment of the Christian God. This is a God Ulysses does not know, and whose commandments need not concern him. For a pagan, approaching this island cannot be considered a sin. I think here we have to be careful. For Dante, God is not one God among many others, but the one and only, the creator of the universe. Since the fall, Adam, Eve, and all their progeny are banned from terrestrial paradise. All their progeny, this obviously includes Ulysses. On the other hand, Ulysses has no idea about the location, nor even about the existence of terrestrial paradise. He is sailing into the unknown, but he knows very well that he is sailing where he should not, as he himself tells us. And this is again part of his narration. Venimmo, so I and my companions, venimmo a quella foce stretta, dove Ercule segnò li suoi riguardi, a ciò che l'uomo più oltre non si metta. And we should not forget that Hercules in the Middle Ages was often understood as a prefiguration of Christ. Ulysses perfectly understands the prohibition to sail further and consciously disregards it. Third argument. Ulysses' will to pursue his expedition into the unknown, and especially his speech in praise of the acquisition of knowledge, cannot be a sin, for they correspond to a human ideal that was already expressed by Aristotle and to which Dante explicitly subscribes. Let me quote again the central verse of Ulysses' speech. Fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma perseguir virtute e conoscenza. You were not created to live like brutes, but to follow after virtue and knowledge. Both concepts, virtue and knowledge, are of primary importance for Dante. Let us concentrate on knowledge. We shall come back to virtue in a moment. Dante's philosophical treatise Convivio, the Banquet, written immediately before the Commedia, the very first chapter starts with a sentence that quotes the famous beginning of Aristotle Metaphysics. Again, the very first sentence of Aristotle Metaphysics. All men naturally desire knowledge. Tutti gli uomini naturalmente desiderano di sapere. For Aristotle, as well as for Dante, the pursuit of knowledge is what distinguishes mankind from any other living being. On the other hand, there is also an excessive longing for knowledge, for longing for knowledge that has no specific purpose. Augustine called it curiosity. He and most theologians after him considered it to be a vice. In our quest for knowledge, we have therefore to be aware of our limits and of what is good for us. We need, beyond natural reason, a more reliable orientation. And this, the reliable orientation, leads directly to the second term, virtue. Let me quote again Dante's introduction to the Ulysses episode. After having expressed his sorrow, Dante adds something like a self-admonition. E più l'ingegno freno chi non soglio, perché non corra che virtù non guidi, sicché se stella buona o miglior cosa m'ha dato il ben, ch'io stesso non m'invidi. Ingegno is Dante's intellectual capability, something that he has in common with Ulysses. This is a frequent term in the comedy, and Dante is usually quite proud of his ingegno, but here, in these verses, ingegno sounds rather like something dangerous that needs to be restrained and guided by virtue. Virtue, in its most general meaning, is the disposition to behave in a certain way. For Dante, a being has virtue insofar as it is capable of reaching the goal which it has been created for. For Dante, the origin of all virtue is God, and emanating from God, divine virtue permeates the entire universe, giving rise to innumerable different virtues, so that every being acquires its specific form and its orientation towards a goal. Without the help of divine virtue, men risk missing their purpose. In this sense, virtue offers guidance towards salvation. It depends on a man's free will whether he accepts this guidance or not. In his self-admonition, Dante is implicitly comparing himself with somebody who did not restrain his ingegno and who did not accept the guidance of virtue. And this can only be Ulysses. Actually, Ulysses also appeals to virtue in the speech to his companions, but what he calls virtue there is very different from the virtue Dante is seeking guidance from. Dante's virtue is a cosmic flow that connects humans with God. Ulysses' virtue, on the contrary, is a purely individual quality that expresses itself in manly actions, a very masculine quality. It corresponds to ancient Roman virtus, which could easily be translated as courage and endurance. Finally, and this is decisive, we have to consider the situation in which Ulysses utters his words. The ship has reached the limits of the inhabited world. Ulysses' original intent had been to explore all humans' values and wickedness. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, no experience of such kind is to be gained. the voyage into the world without people is hardly to legitimize, even by Ulysses' own standards. The humanists usually consider Ulysses' speech to his companions as the strongest argument in favor of their interpretation. Unfortunately, this speech is also the strongest argument against it. The speech is indeed an outstanding example of evil advice, and evil advice is, of course, exactly the sin punished in the 8th ditch of the 8th circle. With his speech leading to disaster, death, and the damnation, Ulysses cheats not only his companions, but also himself, which does not make the evil advice any better. Ulysses' ultimate sin lies in an excess of self-confidence, in a refusal to accept any kind of bounds and limits, geographical limits, but also, and more severely, social, moral, and epistemological limits. Let me sum up. Benedetto Croce's advice to read the story of Ulysses in Canto 26 as an isolated poem without considering its context was not good advice. Reading the Ulysses episode in context, we understand that Ulysses is not the prophet of humanism and progress. Dante knows neither of humanism nor of progress. Ulysses is rather the warning example of a man with high capabilities who is led to perdition by an excess of self-confidence and a total neglect of bounds and limits. The humanistic interpretation of Ulysses proposed by Benvenuto and by several Dante scholars since the 19th century can be proven wrong by applying the method of historical hermeneutics. But before we dismiss it, we should use it as a key to solve the puzzle in Levi's chapter, the Canto of Ulysses. Back to Levi. There can be no doubt that Levi's approach to the figure of Ulysses stands directly in the tradition of the humanistic interpretation. How did Levi get to know this interpretation? He was a reader of Dante, not of Dante scholarship. But among the humanists, we have found famous authors like De Sanctis and Croce. De Sanctis' History of Italian Literature was standard reading for a wide audience of educated readers. And the same is obviously true for Croce, who, for a young anti-fascist like Levi, might have been one of the few authorities that still could be respected. But even if Levi had not read De Sanctis and not read Croce, his school teachers were surely familiar with both of them. So Levi might have come in contact with the humanistic interpretation at school, as I did 1 generation later. In Levi's chapter on the Canto of Ulysses, we find a gripping combination of intellectual energy, clarity, and despair. This does obviously not derive from scholarly traditions. It is rooted in the emergency situation in which Levi was mobilizing all his powers in order to make sense of what was happening around him. Levi takes recourse to Dante's lines on his walk with Piccolo to fetch the soup, and this is hardly a situation in which Levi or anybody else in Levi's place would be interested in historical hermeneutics. Being trapped in hell, Levi happens to find in Dante's Inferno a figure that seems to offer an antidote to human degradation. No wonder he jumps at these lines. To him, Ulysses' speech sounds like a blast of a trumpet, like the voice of God. And now let's look again at the last passage of the chapter. I keep Piccolo back. It is virtually necessary, vitally necessary and urgent that he listen, that he understand this has pleased another before it is too late. Tomorrow he or I might be dead, or we might never see each other again. I must tell him I must explain to him about the Middle Ages and the so human and so necessary and yet unexpected anachronism, but still more something gigantic that I myself have only just seen in a flash of intuition, perhaps the reason for our fate, for our being here today. The so human and so necessary and yet unexpected anachronism can only mean Ulysses' speech to his companions, which Levi reads as a plea for human dignity. In these lines, just 2 pages earlier, Levi had meant to hear the voice of God, but this, he realizes now, was a mistake. It was not God, it was Ulysses who was speaking. And in Ulysses' story, God is not an ally. He is not a benevolent and protecting force, but one causing disaster. The whirlwind coming from the island is not a meteorological accident. It is a divine instrument, and the shipwreck is a kind of execution. To Levi, this insight comes as a shock. It leads to the intuition of, quote again, something gigantic that I myself have only just seen, perhaps the reason for our fate, for our being here today. We can try to spell out what Levi had just seen. If there is a God, then it must have been he who directed the whirlwinds of history, bringing Levi and his companions to Auschwitz. The text itself merely has a hint. It leaves the conclusion to the reader. Levi was already in his youth a very secular person, a scientist, a non-believer, and even more a Jewish non-believer. As such, he had little commitment to Christian theology. In this passage, Levi gets closer to theology than in any other of his writings. It is the darkest possible theology, appropriate to the place and to the time. And let me end with a closer look at the very last word of the chapter. The last line cites the last line of Canto 26, but with a tiny change that might at first look like a mistake. On top you see Dante, Canto 26, line 142, In finché il mar fu sovra noi richiuso. Then comes the first edition of the Questo, uomo, 1947. In finché il mar fu sopra noi richiuso. This quotation of Dante's last line is perfectly correct, except that Levi modifies Dante's sovra into sopra, which is the usual form in modern Italian. The modification is semantically irrelevant. But then finally, the second edition, 1958. In fil che il mar fu sopra noi rinchiuso. Levi has changed the final word. It is not richiuso anymore, it is rinchiuso with an added N. And this cannot be an error. Levi has chosen to misquote Dante, and the spelling rinchiuso has been maintained in all later editions. Richiudere and rinchiudere are 2 different verbs. Richiudere means to close again. Rinchiudere means to lock up. To lock up the sea sounds semantically inappropriate. But is it really inappropriate considering that Dante's verse is being quoted by somebody who is locked up in Auschwitz? Rinchiuso is not a mistake of Levi, the writer. It is a slip of tongue of Levi, the protagonist of the story. And the slip evokes a disturbing, profoundly disturbing image. The whole sea has been locked up, something that only an omnipotent, malevolent God could achieve, turning the whole world into something like a concentration camp. And with this apocalyptic image, the chapter ends. Thank you very much.